So we now need to review a bit, going back to the previous section, about what was going on in Japan. Remember, in Japan, there was a fear because they didn't have enough resources, particularly food, and at the same time, their population was going up. They didn't really have any place for that population to go. The United States, by this time, had shut its doors to Japanese immigration, for example, as had other Western countries. So it was their hope to find some place where their so-called excess population could go and where they could get resources. Now, those concerns existed before the Great Depression that began in 1929, but when the Great Depression began, that exacerbated those problems. And many Japanese people saw China as a solution to these problems. There were areas in China where there weren't necessarily a lot of people, and Chinese agriculture could be developed in a way that would help lead to more food, which then could be used to feed Japanese people. And there were ways that you could deal with this. For example, through trade. That would be a way, let's find something the Chinese want. Let's trade with them. Let's form a close trading relationship. That would work. But of course, people, when they trade, they want to make sure the benefits are in their favor. They would like to have certain privileges. And by this time, Japan had lots of privileges in China. And Japanese people would like to have more privileges if possible. The problem is that China is becoming stronger and more unified under the nationalists. Right? When China is weak and divided, it's easy to kind of come in and get China to do what they want it to do. Right? They're able to come in and pressure the Chinese government, which was, remember, before the nationalists was not an effective central government. It was the legally recognized government, but it wasn't very effective. They can bully them and give them money, loan them money to gain influence and so forth, and get them to give up rights to property and things like that to their land. But a nationalist government, led by the Nationalist Party, is not going to be so easy to bully. Right? So you have this problem, right? There's this anxiety that we talked a lot about in the previous section among Japanese people about their country, about their future, about their empire. And they see China as a way of solving those problems, right? Land and resources. But China's becoming stronger and more unified. So that just makes them even more fearful. Now, what would maybe make sense is to try and build closer diplomatic relationships with China to actually help China to become more unified and use that goodwill and that influence to find a kind of compromise that helps both countries. There is in this time period a possible diplomatic solution, right? Japan could have said, oh, let's work more with this new government because it's going to unify China. We might as well work with them and stay on their good side. And we can use that to maybe maintain at least some of our privileges, or at least to find something so that we can get the food and the resources we need. They could have done this through diplomacy. However, remember, democracy is becoming weak in the 1930s in Japan and is finally replaced essentially by militarism. Right? So there's this concern in Japan over this rising China, what to do about this rising China. There were certainly diplomatic options, but because the military is coming to power, and remember, it will kill people who gets in its way, they're going to be the ones calling the shots. And soldiers, make sense, try and solve their problems through military means. Right? Diplomats try and solve their problems diplomatically. Believers in democracy try and solve their problems through democracy. People in the military tend to try and solve their problems through military action. And the problem is in Japan, because the military is calling the shots, it's the one that dominates, it's going to make sure that it gets to implement its militaristic policies to try and deal with these very serious situations that Japan faces. And by the way, on the right, that's a very famous picture of Japanese children eating daikon, which are Japanese radishes. But I think the idea is it's supposed to show their relative poverty here, because they haven't even prepared the radishes. They're just eating them raw, and they're standing in front of this kind of hut that they're living in. So it's important to remember that even though Japan in some ways was powerful, it also had a lot of poverty still, even this time period. Right? And Japanese soldiers were coming from this kind of poorer background predominantly, especially the officer class. And the part of China that the Japanese military are going to look at most closely is a region we refer to as Manchuria, right? The homeland of the Manchu people, though by this time it is predominantly made up of Han Chinese. but it's an area that borders Korea, which is a Japanese colony that is not far from Japan. And so many Japanese people will look to this part of China as an area where they can expand. In particular, it's important, and I've kind of implied this, but I want to make this a little bit more explicit. Even though it is legally Chinese territory, the Russians, the Japanese, and other people often have special rights in this area. For example, the Japanese control the major railway in the southern part of Manchuria. Remember, they've leased that area near Manchuria to the west of Korea, known as the Liaodong Peninsula, also called Kwantung. So, in a sense, if you're Japanese and a member of the Japanese military, it makes sense to try and expand into this part of China because it's, in a sense, it's an area that is under Chinese jurisdiction, but that is not under Chinese control, right? A lot of it is administered by the Japanese already, some of the most important areas, as well as by other places, people as well. So this is a very important area that theoretically could be pulled away from China and made somehow a part of the Japanese empire, right? So basically, remember, it's legally Chinese, but the Chinese are having trouble actually administering and controlling it. So at this point, I need to talk a little bit about what makes Manchuria so important, right? It's not just the fact that it's next to Japan and the Japanese Empire, but also what makes it so important and why Japan would be interested in it. First of all, Manchuria is larger than France, Germany, and Austria combined. This is not a small piece of territory we're talking about, right? Let me repeat that. It is larger than France, Germany, and Austria combined. It is gigantic. If you look at the amount of resources there, Manchuria accounted for 90% of China's oil, 70% of its iron, more than half of its gold, and a third of its trade. This is an extraordinarily important area. It is the industrial center of China. Now, one reason why it was so industrialized is that by 1931, Japan had invested very seriously in Manchuria, right? Of the foreign investments in Manchuria, 72% came from Japan, right? So this is an area that is extraordinarily wealthy. A good portion of the wealth has been developed, especially the industrial part of that wealth, by Japanese investments. So Japan already has a strong financial interest in the region. Japan also controlled the Southern Manchurian Railway. So it was in charge of a large part of the transportation of this area, of the infrastructure. And also Japan was allowed to keep an army, it's called the Kwantung Army, in southern Manchuria in order to protect that railway, right? The Japanese are allowed to have soldiers there to control that railway. So you can already see this. This is a big place with a lot of resources, a lot of wealth, and Japan already has its foot in the door. It's not going to be hard to open that door all the way and take all of Manchuria. The Japanese were also frustrated. The Chinese warlord who governed Manchuria, remember, I said earlier that during the Northern Expedition, even though Chiang Kai-shek was able to unify much of China, he didn't unify all of it 100% completely. He accepted the surrender or the obedience, supposedly, of these warlords in the north and the west. So you had a Chinese warlord far in the north who was only loosely under Chiang Kai-shek's command. And that guy was making business more difficult for the Japanese. He didn't much like the Japanese. He was trying to make it harder for them to expand their commercial interests in Manchuria because he correctly realized, of course, that they might want to take over Manchuria completely. So Manchuria is very important to the Japanese. It's a very important place, lots of resources. They've invested a lot in it. They've got a railroad there. They've got soldiers there. And a lot of Japanese people are fearful about their future and think they need resources from China, such as these here in Manchuria, in order for their empire to survive. But the Chinese are seem to be making it difficult to do that, right? China's getting stronger through the national unification, and even just this warlord in Manchuria is giving them a hard time from their perspective. So Japan sees the resources it needs, it's getting access to them, but it's fearful that it might lose that access. as China becomes stronger. And to give you a sense of the kind of conflict that would occur here, and I think this is important because it really brings together the fact that we're talking about how these three countries, China, Japan, and Korea, really influence each other. So Japanese subjects had the right to settle in Manchuria. They could immigrate and settle there. Koreans, the Japanese government argued, were members of the Japanese Empire and therefore also had the ability to immigrate to Manchuria and settle there, and they would be under Japanese jurisdiction, even though, remember, this is Chinese territory. And they had that right because they had unequal treaties. And you can see a lot of Koreans move to Manchuria, right? On that map of, you can see Korea to the south, Manchuria to the north. You can see all the different places where Koreans are living. Those are marked with little black dots. And you can see the area around Korea in particular is just black because there's so many Koreans living there. So lots of Koreans are coming there. Now this leads to conflict with the Chinese who are living there. And I want to stress, this is what's kind of complicated and confusing, but it's important to understand this. Manchuria is called Manchuria because it's the homeland of the Manchus. However, they are only a minority here. The majority of people living in Manchuria are Han Chinese, different ethnic group, right? The majority group of the Chinese. So it's called Manchuria, the land of the Manchus, but the majority people there are Han Chinese. And you also have other minorities such as the Japanese and Koreans. Now, what happens in the Wanpo-shan incident, and Wanpo-shan is an area in more south-central Manchuria near the important city of Changchun. Koreans will immigrate there and will purchase land through a Chinese broker, right? They'll purchase land through a Chinese broker. They will then attempt to dig an irrigation ditch across Chinese land. It seems to, I think, and the facts are a little unclear, but it seems that the Koreans thought they had the right to do this. But of course, the Chinese who had that land were upset that someone was digging a ditch across their land because, of course, if someone puts a ditch in the middle of your land, it makes it harder for you to farm. But the Koreans had to dig that ditch so they could irrigate their field that they bought from the Chinese broker. So a conflict developed between the Koreans and the Chinese, both of whom thought they had the right to do what they were doing. The Koreans thought they had the right to dig the ditch to irrigate their land. The Chinese thought they had the right to protect their own land. So what happened is the Chinese protest. The Chinese police then will come to investigate to figure out what's going on. But before that's completed, Chinese peasants will drive the Koreans away because the Koreans had refused to stop digging the ditch. And then Japanese police will come and intervene and basically drive out the Chinese police and will act to protect the Koreans. So you can see that this is a very complex incident with implications of ethnic conflict, right, between Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans. And we'll come back to that issue of conflict between the ethnicities later. I just want to point out for now that this is the kind of thing that is going to lead the Japanese to want to take over Manchuria. And this will happen shortly before the Japanese essentially do take over Manchuria, right? They want to get control over it so that they can gain access to its resources and make sure that its subjects, right, are able to expand, whether they be Korean or Japanese, because the more Japanese subjects living in Manchuria, the more the Japanese can control it. Now, what this will lead to then, though, and I want to talk about this because it shows how these areas are connected. It shows how these three different ethnic groups are trying to relate to each other. The Japanese, of course, they intervened to protect the Koreans, but news reached Korea that the Chinese had actually killed Koreans. This was not true. There were no casualties. No one was killed in this Wanpo-shan incident. But this makes the Koreans angry, and they engage in anti-Chinese riots in Korea. There's a Chinese minority living in Korea in the north, especially, and a lot of Koreans will attack them, and there'll be several Chinese who are killed. The Chinese respond in China by attacking Koreans. So there'll be anti-Korean riots in response to in China, in response to the anti-Chinese riots in Korea, in response to the Wanpo-shan incident. So this is very, very complex, right? And you can see that there's this kind of jockeying for position among these three different groups, with Koreans and Japanese at times working together, right? The Koreans are imperial subjects of Japan and expect the Japanese imperial government to protect them. Later we'll see that Koreans and Chinese will work together against the Japanese. we have to understand that from the Chinese perspective, this is going to lead to an increase in anti-Japanese empire sentiments, right? You can see here, this is a kind of propaganda, anti-Japanese propaganda, where you can see that the Japanese and the Koreans on the right, you can tell the Koreans because they have that special kind of hat, are attacking the Chinese and bullying them and beating them up on the left. And the Chinese are saying, look, Manchuria is ours. It's a part of our country. How can these Japanese and these Koreans just come in here and do this to us? Right? So you can see there's this kind of ethnic conflict between the Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans over the resources of Manchuria. The Wanpo-shan incident thus illustrates the complex relationship between Japan and the rest of Asia on one side, because it shows that there is a conflict, right? You had this complex relationship between Japanese and Koreans. Many Koreans are unhappy that they are under Japanese control, that they're part of the Japanese empire. However, their relationship with the empire allows them to seek some protection from the Japanese empire as Japanese imperial subjects when they move to Manchuria. But also we can see this helps lead to conflict between Chinese on one side and Japanese and Koreans on the other side. And there's also this kind of complex identity in regards to this relationship, because many Japanese people on one side are very proud of themselves and therefore to a certain extent look down on China and Korea. After all, Japan successfully modernized and was able to build its own empire, including Korea, whereas China is still having these problems. At the same time, they say, well, these are fellow Asians. They look similar to us, and we'll talk more about this kind of ethnic issue later on. But there are fellow Asians, and so we have a kind of duty to help them. And remember, that was part of why Japan decided to colonize Korea and made an argument for why it was right that they should do so, because as the first Asians to successfully modernize, they were the best able to teach Koreans to do likewise. So there's this very complex kind of Japanese identity. On one side, they look down on other Asians to a certain degree. Not all Japanese do this, but this is kind of the dominant view. On the other side, they feel a duty to these other Asians, right? And especially a duty to protect them from the West and to liberate them from the West. And understanding this tension, this even contradiction between this kind of feelings of Japanese superiority, but also a desire to save, to liberate their fellow Asians, which will include, of course, Chinese and Koreans are kind of a weird case because they're part of the Japanese empire. But in any case, liberate them from the threat of Western imperialism. And we saw that kind of idea with Kita Iki. We're also going to see it with this man, Ishiwara Kanji. And in a sense, what makes him a bit different is that Kita Iki is the theorist, but Ishiwara Kanji is an actual soldier who is going to put these kinds of ideas into play. So Ishiwara Kanji was a Japanese soldier who was part of the Kwantung Army, so he was stationed in Manchuria. He was not a particularly high-ranking soldier. He was only a colonel. He was not a general. Like Kita Iki, he was what I would call a Buddhist nationalist. It's a little bit complex, but remember we talked about how earlier the Japanese had this belief that the emperor was the descendant of Amaterasu, the sun goddess. That's a part of Shinto, the Shinto faith, which is kind of the indigenous religion in Japan. Buddhism is also very popular in Japan, and you can be a Buddhist and a follower of Shinto at the same time. It's not a problem. But people tend to emphasize one over the other. And Ishiwara Kanji tended to emphasize a sort of Buddhist nationalism. And so he was a little bit more open to other Asians. Shinto is an indigenous religion unique to Japan, but Buddhism is more of a universal religion that there were lots of Buddhist followers in Korea and China as well. So he tends to be more open to the possibility of other Asians being equal, and he really believes deeply in the need to create a harmonious relationship between Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans. Right? He is not happy with this kind of conflict we saw in the Wanpo-shan incident. And he is a true believer in this. Some people kind of use these ideas to be kind of hypocritical and just to advance Japan's power. But Ishiwara Kanji actually believes in the importance of a kind of true, deep relationship between the people of East Asia. And part of why he believes this is he thinks there's going to be a coming race war. He thinks that there's going to be a war between the white powers, especially Russia, and the yellow powers, led by Japan. There they use this kind of race color language. So he believes in a coming race war and is therefore a Pan-Asianist. Now, again, the problem is, even though this guy in many ways is sympathetic, like Kita-Iki, to the Chinese situation and to the Chinese people, he thinks that because China is having so many difficulties, a lot of being made by Japan, and like many military officers, he doesn't seem to accept that the Chinese are developing and building their state. He says China's weak, it's not doing well. We need resources to prepare for the war, so we're just going to take Manchuria from China. Right, so Ishiwara Kanji's, again, this complex figure because he wants to, in a sense, help China, but he thinks that China isn't capable of helping itself. Right, he doesn't think China is capable of helping itself. So he thinks that Japan needs to get a hold of Manchuria to prepare for that coming race war. And he also believes that because Manchuria has multiple different ethnic groups, the majority of people living in Manchuria, remember, are not Manchus. They are Han Chinese, but there are also Koreans, Manchurians, people of the Manchu ethnicity, and Japanese. And his idea is, let's gain control of Manchuria, both so we can get the resources, but also so that we can show that it is possible for us to have harmony and union between these different East Asian peoples so that we can unite together to be powerful and to liberate the rest of Asia from the Westerners and win this coming race war. And I think Ishiwara Kanji is a perfect example of this kind of problem in the Japanese military mentality, right? That they want, among those who are idealistic, they do have this idea, we're liberating Asia. We're going to liberate China. We're going to save all these countries from the West. But to do that, we have to help, even if the Chinese don't want it. Even if the Chinese are building up their government, we all know that the Chinese are not really capable of doing stuff, of really getting their act together. So we need to come in and take over Manchuria, right? Because the Chinese are not capable. So it's this idea, we need to liberate the Chinese. We need to help them, but there's also something fundamentally wrong with them. They can't do it themselves. And one of the biggest problems I see with the Japanese military, and to a certain extent the Japanese public during this time period, is they will not take the Chinese seriously. Right? As we've seen before in this class, China is going through deep changes. Chiang Kai-shek is building a powerful centralized government. But the Japanese, especially the Japanese military, just seem to refuse to acknowledge that and to say consistently, the Chinese can't take care of themselves, so we have to take care of them for themselves, whether they like it or not. And this fundamental misunderstanding, which is almost willful, is in a sense going to doom the Japanese policy towards China and lead to the death of a lot of people. As we'll see, it's even counterproductive to Japanese interests. And what Ishiwara Kanji is going to do is get together with other military officers, none of whom hold a rank above colonel. There's no generals here. And what they're going to do is they're going to come up with a plot. And their plot is to blow up a section of the Southern Manchuria Railroad. Remember, that's the railroad the Japanese control in Manchuria. Claim that the Chinese did it, and then use their army, which they're allowed to station in there to protect the railroad, to take over Manchuria. And that's what they do. They blow up, or they set rather some bombs on the Southern Manchuria Railway, claim that the Chinese did it, and that in order to protect the railway, they need to take over all of Manchuria. So Ishiwara Kanji's army army he's a part of will do that. Forces from Korea will also join in as well. And there's two things I want to note about this. First of all, this is not being directed by the government in Tokyo what happens is you have these relatively low-ranking officers, none of these guys are generals, causing an incident and then claiming that they have to deal with that incident right away, so there's not really time to wait for orders. And then the generals saying, okay, well, this worked. We've seized Manchuria, and they do seize Manchuria. We're good with this. We accept it. So what happens in Japan is you've got these low-ranking military officers just doing what they want, and the high-ranking officers refusing to restrain them, because a lot of times the high-ranking officers support this and think that this is a good idea, or they're kind of nervous because of what's happened to other people who have tried to defy the army. And I didn't go into this too much earlier, but I should point out that at times soldiers would assassinate other soldiers who disagreed with them. The civilian government is unable to deal with this issue. The civilian government is unable to prevent the army from doing this, in part because the emperor refuses to support the civilians. And the public supports this. The one group of people who tries to restrain the military in this situation is the prime minister and the democratically elected government, but the people do not support them. The people are happy that this new area of land is being added to the Japanese Empire, so they end up supporting the army. We talked about this previously in the other section, is that the people themselves will turn against democracy. The emperor refuses to support the civilian government, so the military learns, okay, we can do what we want. No one's going to restrain us. And so what's going to happen is it's going to be the military that's going to drag the whole Japanese government, the whole Japanese nation into war, because no one is able to restrain them. The other thing I just want to point out is this is just clumsy and laughable, this claim. First of all, you can't justify taking over a territory the size of France, Germany, and Austria combined because someone blew up a section of your railway, right? That's crazy, bluntly speaking. That's just way too much. You know, we can take over this territory because you destroyed part of our railway. You know, like I said, this place is huge. You can't take it all just because someone destroyed part of your railway. And I chose this picture on purpose. That's the part of the railway where the bomb went off. You see the circle? Do you see where someone circled it? That's it. That's all. So it's not like they even did serious damage. This was incredibly minor damage that was easy to repair. And this just shows, in a sense, the kind of ham-fisted brutality of the military, that they'll just make these outrageous claims, carry out these incidents to give just a fig leaf of legality, and it's just laughable. And no one in the world really accepts this. And this is going to help lead to Japan's diplomatic isolation, right? And this is because, again, the army has gotten out of control, and the only people that are willing to restrain the army is the civilian government. They don't have the power to do it, and no one's willing to support them. So to reiterate, the Japanese army will quickly seize control of Manchuria. The civilian government in Japan cannot stop them, and no one will support the civilian government. Right, civilian government's pretty much just trying to restrain this military. No one will do it. By the way, the prime minister who does attempt to restrain the army will be fired, and then a later prime minister who tries to also restrain the army and its goals will be assassinated, and no one helps them. So democracy is going to fall in Japan. Now, what's complex though here is that the Japanese military wants to establish a puppet state. They don't want to make Manchuria a part of the Japanese empire formally, because that would seem just like naked Japanese imperialism. That would seem like expansionism. What they instead present is they argue that this is basically the realization of Manchu nationalism. This is Manchuria. Shouldn't the Manchus govern in Manchuria? I mean, the Chinese have been saying China for the Chinese, get rid of the Manchus. So it seems logical that the Manchu people should get their own country in Manchuria. And this is logical. The one problem with it is that the majority of people living in Manchuria are actually of Chinese ethnicity. So it creates kind of a complex situation. So Japan does not, the Japanese soldiers who carry this out, they don't want to make this formally a part of the Japanese empire, in part because that would mean that the other Japanese parts of the government would be able to argue that they should have some control of it. The military wants to make sure it's in control, and the military will basically keep control. But they're not going to present this as Japanese imperialism. They're going to present this as the realization of Manchu nationalism. To that end, they will bring in Puyi as emperor. Who is Puyi, you might ask? He is the last Qing ruler. There's an old movie, but you may have seen it, called The Last Emperor. It's about his life. He was like 4 years old when his government, when the Qing were overthrown in China. But he was the last emperor. He was crowned emperor. He was like 4, and then he was forced to abdicate. And the Japanese will bring him in to act as the emperor. And he basically becomes their puppet. In particular, the puppet of the Japanese military. So you've got this very curious situation where the Japanese military establishes this state of Manchukuo. That's what it's called. It means just Manchu country. But it's a supposedly independent state in which the Japanese military is actually in charge, but they rule through this Manchu last emperor named Puyi. So it's a very, very complex situation, but the military wants to do this so they can stay in control. Right? They don't want Tokyo. They don't want the Japanese government telling them what to do. They want to be able to build Manchuria the way they want to build it. And also, as we'll see, they'll use it as a base to expand further into China. Now, China will bring this issue to the League of Nations because this has been, if we think in terms of international law, this has long been recognized as a part of China. It's recognized as part of the Republic of China, right? Legally speaking. And so the League of Nations, which is kind of a precursor to the United Nations, will support China. Will say Japan is wrong. This is clearly Chinese territory. Japan has no right to this territory. And it's clearly a puppet state. This is not really an independent state either. This is clearly just Japan coming in and taking over. And Japan will respond by withdrawing from the League of Nations. So now Japan is becoming very diplomatically isolated. Right? So remember in the past, Japan was pretty good at diplomacy. For example, in order to protect themselves, knowing that they might have to go to war with Russia, they formed that alliance with Britain. Right before the Russo-Japanese War, to guarantee that they would not have to fight Russia and other European countries at the same time. They'd only have to fight one. So Japan in the past had been very good at diplomacy. But now, the military is in charge. They're really bad at diplomacy because, I mean, no offense to soldiers, but soldiers specialize in military matters, not in diplomacy. So Japan gets control of Manchuria, but now it's diplomatically isolated. It's seen as increasingly as a pariah state. And this is key to one reason why it's going to end up joining other pariah states, Germany and fascist Italy, in World War II. Not quite there yet. So now, the results are now, though, Japan is increasingly diplomatically isolated. It's in control of Manchuria, though, can get more access to those resources. It will develop them even further. And now, though, it has a base for further expansion against China. Right? It now has a base where it can expand deeper into China.